The sun peeked through the lush canopy of trees, casting playful shadows on the ground of the bustling city park. Birds chirped melodiously, their sweet tunes harmonizing with the laughter of children playing on the swings. Joggers moved rhythmically along the paved paths, their sneakers tapping a gentle cadence. Nearby, a group of elderly men engaged in a spirited game of chess under a large oak tree, their faces wrinkled with concentration. The park, a sprawling oasis in the heart of the city, was alive with energy, a perfect place for relaxation and connection. Everywhere, the scent of freshly cut grass mingled with the tantalizing aroma of coffee and snacks from a nearby food truck. The vibrant flower beds lining the pathways bloomed in a kaleidoscope of colors, their petals swaying gently in the breeze. It was a scene of joy, where families picnicked on checkered blankets, couples strolled hand in hand, and the world seemed to slow down, if only for a while. Yet amid this vibrant harmony, there was a shadow, one that many chose to overlook. Tucked away in the park's quiet corner, near a cluster of overgrown bushes, sat a man who had become a fixture of the landscape. His makeshift shelter, cobbled together with tattered tarps and discarded cardboard, blended into the background, much like the man himself. Few took notice of him, and even fewer dared to engage. He was simply there, like an unspoken secret the park-goers avoided addressing. His name was Daniel. Once, not long ago, he had been a skilled craftsman, renowned for his ability to restore antique furniture to its former glory. His hands, once steady and confident, had transformed countless pieces into works of art. But life has a way of toppling even the strongest. A series of misfortunes, the loss of his workshop to a devastating fire, mounting medical bills from his late wife's illness, and an economic downturn, had left him without a home, without hope. The park became his refuge, its open spaces his roof, and its community his distant, indifferent neighbors. Daniel was a man of quiet dignity. His clothes were worn and patched, his beard unkempt, but his eyes still held a glimmer of the man he used to be. He spent his days observing the world around him, often with a bittersweet smile. He would watch parents chasing their giggling children and remember his own daughter, now grown and far away. He noticed the tiniest details others missed, a fallen petal on the path, the way a child's kite danced in the sky. But to the passers-by, he was invisible. If someone accidentally caught his gaze, they quickly looked away, their expressions a mix of discomfort and guilt. Despite the isolation, Daniel harbored no bitterness. He understood that people had their own lives, their own struggles, but sometimes, just sometimes, he wondered what it would feel like to be seen again, to matter. Little did Daniel know, the day he would matter more than he could imagine was just around the corner. The day began like any other in the bustling park. Morning joggers had long since cleared out, replaced by a mix of families enjoying the sun, students sprawled on blankets with open books, and a few workers taking their lunch breaks under the shade of the trees. The atmosphere was relaxed, the hum of conversation blending seamlessly with the occasional bark of a dog or the distant melody of an ice cream truck's jingle. Daniel sat on his usual bench in the park's corner, where the trees formed a protective canopy overhead. He had grown accustomed to the rhythm of the park, noticing patterns most others would miss. He could tell which families were regular visitors and which were newcomers by the way they carried themselves. He could distinguish the happy cries of children from their tired whines when it was time to leave. It was his world, a world he observed but rarely participated in. But today, something felt different. A faint whiff of smoke reached his nose, so subtle that at first he thought he'd imagined it. Daniel looked up from the old book he'd found in a donation pile weeks ago and scanned the park. The usual sights greeted him. A young couple sharing a laugh over iced coffee, a dog chasing a frisbee, and a group of teenagers sprawled on the grass. Everything seemed normal. Then he noticed it, a small trail of smoke rising from the direction of the picnic area. At first, it was barely visible, blending with the haze of the warm afternoon. Daniel squinted, trying to pinpoint the source. It was coming from the edge of the park, near the dry brush that bordered the walking paths. He leaned forward, gripping the edge of the bench. Something wasn't right. The smoke thickened, its faint gray tendrils curling into the sky. Still, no one seemed to notice. A group of friends sat only a few feet away from the brush, too absorbed in their conversation to glance around. Daniel's heart quickened. He had seen enough fires in his life to recognize the danger, especially in a park like this, where the dry grass and leaves could ignite quickly. His eyes darted to the possible causes. Near the picnic area, an unattended barbecue sat smoldering. Its coals, still glowing red, released occasional sparks that floated dangerously close to the nearby shrubs. Further down the path, a bird hopped near a discarded cigarette butt, nudging it into the grass with its beak. Either of these could have been the culprit. It didn't matter now. What mattered was that the fire had begun, and no one was paying attention. Daniel's mind raced. He knew how quickly things could spiral out of control. The flames, though small now, could spread within minutes. He could almost hear the crackling sound of dry leaves catching fire, smell the acrid smoke that would soon fill the air. He clenched his fists, torn between two thoughts. One part of him whispered, "Stay out of it. This isn't your problem." After all, what could a homeless man like him do? He had no resources, no authority. If he drew attention to himself, would anyone even take him seriously? Or worse, would they accuse him of starting the fire? But the other part, the stronger part, wouldn't let him look away. Daniel couldn't ignore the image playing out in his mind. Children running in panic, families scattering, the beautiful park engulfed in flames. He had seen enough loss in his life. He couldn't stand by and watch it happen again. Taking a deep breath, he stood up. His legs felt heavy, as if they were resisting his decision to intervene. But he forced himself to move, stepping closer to the source of the smoke. As he walked, he scanned the area for anything that could help. A nearby faucet caught his eye, along with an old plastic bucket someone had left behind. It wasn't much, but it was a start. By the time Daniel reached the edge of the brush, the fire had grown. Small flames licked at the dry grass, and the heat was palpable. He glanced around again, hoping someone else might notice. The group of friends nearby were still oblivious, their laughter echoing in stark contrast to the urgency of the situation. "Hey!" Daniel called out, his voice hoarse from disuse. The friends turned to him briefly, their expressions a mix of confusion and indifference, before returning to their conversation. Frustrated but undeterred, Daniel grabbed the bucket and rushed to the faucet. He filled it with water, the seconds feeling like hours as the stream trickled slowly. By the time it was full, the flames had doubled in size. He ran back, splashing the water over the fire's edge. Steam hissed as the flames recoiled, but it wasn't enough. For a moment, doubt crept in. What if I can't stop it? But then he remembered why he was doing this. This wasn't just about saving the park. It was about doing the right thing, regardless of whether anyone noticed or cared. With renewed determination, Daniel sprinted back to the faucet, filling the bucket again. His actions became a blur of motion, running, pouring, running again. Sweat dripped down his face, mixing with the grime that had become a permanent part of him. His arms ached, his legs burned, but he didn't stop. As the fire began to retreat, Daniel glanced up and noticed something unexpected. A few people had stopped to watch. Their faces, once indifferent, now showed hints of curiosity, even concern. But Daniel didn't have time to process this. The fire was his focus, and he wasn't done yet. For a moment, Daniel stood frozen as the reality of the fire set in. His heart pounded against his ribs, his breathing shallow from the rising smoke. He looked back at the park, bustling with life, children running through the grass, families enjoying picnics, couples lounging beneath the trees. If the fire spread, It would destroy this sanctuary. Worse, someone could get hurt. A voice in his head whispered, "Walk away. You've done enough. Let someone else handle it." But another louder voice, one forged from years of facing adversity, pushed back. "You can't wait for someone else. If you don't act now, it'll be too late." The decision was clear. He couldn't ignore this. Not today, not ever. Daniel glanced around for anything that could help. The fire was creeping steadily, the dry grass and leaves fueling its growth. The small plastic bucket he had spotted earlier sat abandoned near the faucet, and he sprinted toward it, the soles of his worn shoes crunching against the gravel path. He filled the bucket as quickly as he could, the cold water splashing over his trembling hands. With a grunt, he hauled the bucket toward the fire and flung its contents at the base of the flames. A satisfying hiss erupted as the water made contact, steam curling into the air. But the flames weren't done. They surged forward as if angry at his defiance, and Daniel realized he would need far more than one bucket to extinguish them. "Stay calm," he told himself. "Think, think." Scanning the area, he spotted a discarded jacket lying on a nearby bench. Without hesitation, he grabbed it and soaked it under the faucet. The fabric was heavy and dripping as he ran back to the fire, using it to smother smaller flames along the edges. Each slap of the wet jacket brought a new wave of hissing steam, but also renewed hope. It was working, little by little. The heat was intense now, stinging his skin and making his throat burn with every breath. Sweat trickled down his face, mixing with soot and grime. Yet, he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Behind him, he heard murmurs and the faint sound of laughter. Turning briefly, he saw a small group of teenagers pointing at him, their phones out, recording his every move. They weren't helping. They were mocking him. One of them called out, "Hey, old man, you playing firefighter now?" Daniel clenched his jaw, forcing himself to ignore them. He had no time for their ridicule. Let them laugh. This isn't about them. Each trip to the faucet felt longer than the last, his legs growing heavier with each stride. Still, he kept going, filling the bucket, dousing the fire, and repeating the process. The flames were stubborn, flaring up in new spots, even as he extinguished others. He began to use anything he could find, an old newspaper to fan the flames back, a nearby soda bottle filled with water to target smaller flare-ups. His resourcefulness, born from years of survival on the streets, became his greatest weapon. The fire crackled, almost as if taunting him, but Daniel refused to back down. He crouched low to avoid the worst of the smoke, his movements deliberate and focused. Each time he poured water or slapped down the soaked jacket, he pictured the people in the park, the children, the parents, the elderly. He wasn't just fighting a fire, he was protecting them, even if they didn't realize it. Eventually, his persistence began to pay off. The flames, once vibrant and wild, started to lose their strength. The smoke thinned, the heat dissipating as the fire shrank into isolated patches. Daniel worked tirelessly, making sure every ember was extinguished. As the last flicker of flame died out, he dropped the soaked jacket and fell to his knees, exhausted. His chest heaved with heavy breaths, his body screaming for rest. For a moment, the world around him seemed to pause. The danger had passed, and the park was safe. He looked up, expecting to see the park returning to its normal rhythm, but what greeted him was unexpected. A crowd had gathered, larger than he'd realized, their faces a mixture of astonishment and guilt. Some of them clapped hesitantly, others just stared. The teenagers who had been laughing earlier stood silently now, their phones lowered. A small child tugged on his mother's hand and pointed at Daniel. "Mom, is he a hero?" the child asked, loud enough for Daniel to hear. The woman hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, sweetheart, he is." Despite the lingering exhaustion, a warmth spread through Daniel's chest. He hadn't done it for recognition or applause, but hearing those words meant something. For the first time in years, he felt seen, not as a shadow, not as a homeless man, but as a person who had made a difference. Still kneeling on the damp ground, Daniel wiped his soot-covered hands on his pants and allowed himself a small, tired smile. The fire was gone, but something inside him had ignited, something he hadn't felt in a long time. As the last flickers of fire died out and the smoke began to clear, Daniel remained kneeling on the damp ground. His chest heaved, his body aching from exhaustion. But his focus was fixed on the blackened patch of grass where the fire had raged moments ago. The quiet aftermath was surreal. The crackling of flames had been replaced by an almost eerie silence, broken only by the rustling of leaves and the faint murmur of the crowd behind him. When he turned to face the onlookers, their expressions caught him off guard. At first, the crowd had been indifferent, their gazes detached and doubtful. Some had even smirked, dismissing his frantic efforts as the desperate antics of a homeless man seeking attention. Their reluctance to intervene had stung, but Daniel hadn't let it deter him. Now, however, their faces told a different story. The laughter and mockery had vanished. In its place was a mix of awe and guilt. Parents held their children a little closer, while others simply stared, as if trying to reconcile their earlier judgment of him with the hero they now saw before them. A ripple of applause began, hesitant at first, like a tentative wave testing the shore. Then it grew louder, spreading through the crowd until nearly everyone was clapping. Daniel blinked, unsure of how to react. He wasn't used to applause, or attention of any kind for that matter. His instinct was to retreat, to slip back into the shadows where he had always felt most comfortable. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was the sincerity in the eyes of the little girl who stepped forward, her small hand clutching her mother's. "Thank you," the girl said, her voice soft but clear. She looked up at him with wide eyes, her expression a mix of admiration and curiosity. "You saved us." Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His throat, dry and sore from the smoke, betrayed him. Instead, he simply nodded, offering her a faint smile. The girl's mother crouched down beside her and added, "We didn't even realize how dangerous it had gotten. If it weren't for you—" She trailed off, shaking her head as if the thought was too unsettling to finish. "You're a hero." The word hung in the air, almost surreal. Daniel had never thought of himself as a hero. He had only done what he felt was right. But hearing it from someone else, a stranger no less, was a moment he wasn't prepared for. Before he could fully process the situation, another figure emerged from the crowd. This man was different, well-dressed, with a commanding presence that drew attention without effort. He appeared to be in his late 40s, his tailored suit and polished shoes a stark contrast to Daniel's tattered clothes. The man's gaze was intense but kind, his sharp eyes taking in every detail of the scene. "Excuse me," the man said, extending a hand. "I'm Mark Ellison. I run a nonprofit that helps with community development and social rehabilitation." He paused, glancing at the extinguished fire. "What you did here was remarkable." Daniel hesitated, staring at the man's outstretched hand before finally shaking it. His grip was firm but unsure, as if he wasn't quite convinced he belonged in this moment. Mark continued, his tone earnest. "Most people would have walked away, or worse, just stood and watched. But you took action, without hesitation, and possibly saved a lot of lives today." He gestured toward the scorched ground. "Do you know how rare that is? Courage like that? Selflessness?" Daniel shifted uncomfortably under the weight of the praise. I couldn't let it spread," he said hoarsely, his voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't about being brave. It was just what needed to be done." Mark smiled. "That's exactly why it's so extraordinary." The crowd had grown silent again, listening intently to their exchange. Daniel could feel their eyes on him, and for the first time in years it didn't feel like judgment. It felt like something else entirely: respect. A small boy tugged at his father's sleeve and whispered loudly, "Dad, he's like a real superhero." The comment drew a few chuckles from the crowd, lightening the mood. Daniel couldn't help but smile at the comparison, even if it felt far from the truth. Mark stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Daniel could hear. "I'd like to help you," he said. "Whatever circumstances led you here, they don't define you. What does is what you just did." He handed Daniel a business card, the edges crisp and pristine. "When you're ready, come find me. We can figure out the next steps together." Daniel stared at the card, the neatly printed name and number standing out starkly against the clean white background. It felt heavy in his hand, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented. A chance, an opportunity he hadn't dared to imagine. As the crowd began to disperse, several people approached to offer their thanks. Some handed him bottles of water, others clapped him on the shoulder, their gestures genuine. Even the teenagers who had mocked him earlier mumbled awkward apologies before shuffling away. By the time the park returned to its usual rhythm, Daniel was left standing alone, the charred ground a silent testament to what had transpired. For the first time in a long time, he felt something stir within him, a spark of hope. He wasn't just a shadow anymore. He had been seen, acknowledged, and, perhaps most importantly, given a chance to reclaim his place in the world. As the evening sun dipped low on the horizon, the park slowly returned to its usual calm. The faint smell of smoke still lingered in the air, but the danger had passed. The scorched patch of grass stood as a reminder of the fire, but more importantly, it marked the moment when a homeless man named Daniel had changed not only his own life, but the lives of those around him. After the fire was extinguished, the crowd, which had initially hesitated to engage, began to rally around Daniel. A young woman approached him first, carrying a paper bag. "Here," she said, offering it to him with a warm smile. "I had some extra sandwiches. You must be starving after all that." Daniel hesitated before accepting, his hands trembling slightly. "Thank you," he murmured, surprised by the sudden kindness. Soon after, others followed her lead. Someone brought him a bottle of water, another handed him an old but clean jacket to replace his damp and smoke-stained one. The family who had thanked him earlier even offered to buy him a proper meal. Daniel's heart swelled with emotions he hadn't felt in years. Gratitude, belonging, and a faint glimmer of hope. For so long he had been invisible, a shadow in the lives of others. But today, something had shifted. People saw him not as a burden or an outcast, but as a hero. Among the crowd, Mark Ellison, the nonprofit leader, returned, his demeanor both professional and compassionate. "Daniel," he said, placing a hand on his shoulder, "I wasn't kidding earlier. I want to help you. Someone with your courage and determination deserves a second chance." Daniel stared at him, unsure how to respond. I don't know," he stammered. "It's been so long. I wouldn't even know where to start." Mark smiled reassuringly. "You've already started," he said. "What you did today speaks volumes about the kind of person you are. You didn't hesitate to act even when others stood by. That's rare." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "I have an opening at one of my shelters. It's not much, but it's a safe place to stay, and we can work together to figure out your next steps. Maybe even get you back to doing the work you love." The mention of his old craft, restoring antique furniture, brought a flood of memories. Daniel hadn't thought about his trade in years, but the idea of picking up the tools he had once cherished ignited a spark within him. For the first time, the future didn't feel like a void. It felt possible. I don't know what to say," Daniel said, his voice choked with emotion. "I don't deserve this." "Yes, you do," Mark replied firmly, and we're going to make sure you get it." The next few hours passed in a blur. The crowd thinned as the evening wore on, but several people stayed behind to talk to Daniel, each offering their thanks or a small gesture of kindness. A child handed him a hand-drawn picture of a man putting out a fire, labeled with the words, "My hero." It was crude and colorful, drawn with crayon, but to Daniel, it was priceless. Later that evening, Daniel followed Mark to the shelter. It was a modest building on the edge of town, but it was warm, clean, and filled with welcoming faces. For the first time in years, Daniel slept on a real bed. He felt the softness of a pillow beneath his head, the warmth of a blanket around his shoulders. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, he didn't feel alone. Over the following weeks, Daniel's life began to change in ways he had never imagined. With Mark's help, he started attending counseling sessions and rediscovered his love for woodworking. Mark connected him with a small furniture repair shop willing to give him a chance, and soon Daniel was back at work, his skilled hands bringing life to pieces others had discarded. One afternoon, as Daniel worked on restoring an old oak chair, a customer recognized him. "You're the guy from the park, aren't you?" they asked, their eyes wide with amazement. "The one who stopped the fire?" Daniel paused, a faint smile crossing his face. "I guess I am," he said, but in his heart, he didn't feel like a hero. He had only done what he believed anyone should do. As word of his story spread, people began to approach him not just for his work, but for the inspiration he provided. His humility, resilience, and courage resonated with everyone who heard his tale. Reflecting on the events that had brought him here, Daniel often said, "I just did what anyone should do, but it changed my life forever." The park, once a place of solitude and sadness for Daniel, became a symbol of hope and connection. He visited often, not to sit in the shadows, but to enjoy the beauty of the place he had saved. Children would wave at him, families would greet him, and he felt something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. The story of the homeless man who stopped a fire became a legend in the city. It served as a reminder that heroes could come from the most unexpected places. Daniel's journey proved that no matter how invisible someone might feel, their actions could light a path not just for themselves, but for others. As Daniel looked back on that fateful day, he carried a message that had become the cornerstone of his life. Anyone can be a hero. All it takes is courage and the will to act. As Daniel sprinted back and forth with the small plastic bucket, splashing water onto the flames, he noticed the group of teenagers sitting nearby. Their phones pointed at him like they were filming a reality show. One of them chuckled and shouted, "Hey man, what are you doing? You think you're a firefighter?" Daniel, drenched in sweat and water, paused just long enough to shoot back with a wry grin. "Nope, just making sure you guys don't get a front row seat to your own barbecue, unless you prefer being extra crispy." The group exchanged awkward glances, unsure whether to laugh or take him seriously. They quickly lowered their phones and started inching away from the fire. Daniel shook his head, muttering under his breath. Teenagers, always ready to film, never ready to help. Later, as he soaked an old jacket to smother smaller flames, he noticed a child staring at him wide-eyed. The boy's parents stood a safe distance away, clearly unsure of what to do. Daniel gave the kid a quick wink and said, "Don't try this at home, kid." Or anywhere else, for that matter. The boy giggled nervously and tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mom, is he serious?" The mother gave Daniel a sheepish smile, clearly relieved someone was taking control of the situation. Even as the fire hissed and crackled, Daniel couldn't help but quip to himself, "If I'd known today was going to be this exciting, I would have worn my good shoes." Once the flames were out and the crowd began to gather around him, Daniel was overwhelmed by the attention. For a man who had spent years being overlooked, the sudden focus was both flattering and uncomfortable. As people started clapping and thanking him, one young woman approached with her phone out. "Can I take a selfie with you?" she asked, her voice brimming with excitement. Daniel blinked, caught off guard. "A selfie?" he repeated, scratching his head. "Lady, people used to cross the street just to avoid looking at me, and now you want me in your photo album?" The crowd chuckled, but the woman insisted, "Come on, you're a hero. I want to remember this moment." With a shrug, Daniel relented, leaning into the frame with an awkward smile. As more people lined up with their phones, he muttered under his breath, "First they ignore you, then they mock you, and now they want you to trend on social media." Later, when someone handed him a sandwich and a fresh bottle of water, Daniel couldn't resist making one last comment. "You know, for a guy who was invisible 5 minutes ago, I'm starting to feel like a celebrity. Next thing you know, I'll have my own cooking show, Grillmaster Daniel, How Not to Start a Fire." The light-hearted remarks brought smiles and laughter to those around him, easing the tension of the day. Daniel's humor, like his bravery, became another reason people admired him. Even in his humility, he had a way of turning a moment into something unforgettable.